much.
Okay. So today we are going to be covering backend third-party APIs. In week 4, we demoed API usage between the front end to the API and back to the front end. APIs typically are not this simple for security purposes. So today we will be walking through a more practical flow where we send requests from the front end to the back end, to the API, to the back end, and then back to the front end. We will also be covering adding secrets to environment files because with APIs, you'll generally have to authenticate, and authentication is going to be done through API keys. Backend API authentication allows for requests from the backend where credentials can be kept secure. And you're already familiar with same origin policy, which would make APIs inaccessible from the front end if cross-origin requests are not set to have the access control allow origin header. There are industry standards for storing secrets such as API keys, such as encrypting credentials at rest and using industry-approved encryption methods like the 256-byte advanced encryption standard. At most, there are best practices to building APIs, but not so much a set of standards. How an API is designed will vary depending on the intended use case for the user and any goals that the developer may have. So when working with a new API, be prepared to read documentation. There are two types of keys, public and private. So like the names imply, public keys are non-sensitive and can be used on the front end. Private keys are sensitive and should be stored securely on the server using environment variables. Do not ever store your private key in a Git repo. This is why we will be going over environment files in just a sec. While API usage and functionality will vary drastically depending on the API being used, a high-level generalized flow can be summed up like this. You create a user account and you sign in. Then you read the documentation. Then you test API keys, and then you write the code to utilize the API keys. Basically, we could think of this as a general flow because companies will likely want your data. So they'll want you to create a user account to sign in with. There is practically no limit to all the combinations and ways an API can be designed and used. So documentation will have to be provided if companies want to retain users. Since user retention is important to companies, the best APIs will have many user-friendly features, such as allowing for API testing directly through their documentation. And finally, once you've read the documentation, you know what to do, you have your API keys, you are ready to start writing some code. So today, well, this is the part that I will run through, but we may not be able to actually see the code run live. We might troubleshoot it together. If that takes up too much time, then we will just move on because we'll also be going back to the Pokemon application to run the second part of today's demonstration. And I think that's pretty much it for my slides. So let me switch screens. Okay. So here we are back in, we are back in our Pokemon app. I created a fresh fork. I created a virtual environment and I activated that virtual environment. And then I ran pip install -r. You're all familiar with this, right? You don't need me to actually run through it again. You're all pretty comfortable with this. Okay, cool. And let's see. from there, let me pull up today's README. So one of the first things that you will be doing if you were to run through this demo, is to install the requests library. The requests library is what allows us to interface with the application, because interfacing with an application is basically an exchange of requests and responses. So I'm gonna use pip install to call the requests library. It's already installed. That's what you would type if it wasn't installed. And similarly, you will be installing requests underscore OAuth library to utilize OAuth. OAuth is just an authentication platform. It's widely used. There's a lot of good documentation on it. In our case, if we were creating a fresh Django, I wonder if maybe that's why I haven't been able to get this to work. Let's see. If we were to create a Django application from scratch, maybe, but okay, I don't want to get sidetracked. This is the script that the README walks through. It shows you how to import your requests. It imports the requests OAuth library that you have just installed, and it sets authentication parameters. In this case, we have a user and a secret, and then the endpoint that's to be hit, and the response to be received from the request, and then a response JSON to deserialize the result. What I am running into when I am trying to run this is this. Getting a bunch of what I think might be a result of an empty response. And I believe it might just have something to do with the API non-project. Am I sharing the right screen? You can see my VS Code, right?
Yes.
Okay, cool, thanks. Let's take a look at this API and see if we can figure out why it may not be working. I don't know when Chad wrote this README. Something might have changed. So let me switch screens back to the noun project API. So if we were to read this documentation, here's one endpoint. It basically displays a current blacklist associated with a client key. Actually, let's go back up and let's read a little bit about what this API actually is. Grab a hold of the world's visual language. Use it in your service or application. Okay. It lets you know that to get started, you will be creating an API key. So access to the API is available to everyone with a noun project account. And I do not have a noun project account, including users with Playground accounts. So once you have logged in, visit the app management page to generate a new API key. So let's do that. I believe my script isn't working because I don't actually have any credentials, any real credentials in the script. So let's see, how do I make an account with the noun project? This is the app management page. It wants me to do all this. Let's see if it'll just let me do it automatically. Sure. Actually, I don't need that. So I'm going to create my accounts. It wants me to click on a cat. Oh, it wants me to click on a cat in here. That's cool. Another cat. I've proved that I am human, and now it wants to know what my application is called. It's called Django Pokemon app, and it stores Pokemon data in a Django app. Now let's generate an API key. Aha, there's our secret API key, which I really shouldn't be sharing publicly. but there it is. Now let's switch back to, okay, before we switch back, actually, let's go back here and let's take a look at the endpoints that we will be trying to hit. In the demo, we are hitting an endpoint that says, what is this endpoint? Let's see, making requests. Okay, here's some sample code that looks similar to today's README. It wants us to import the requests, import the library. It wants us to pass in an API key and the API secret, which you saw in the other window. And then it wants us to hit this endpoint. What is this endpoint? I don't know. It's a bad request because we are missing our parameters. We will find out what this endpoint is when we run the script. Yes, we take the request and we use the response library to deserialize it, and then we print the response contents. Let's see, what else? Maybe I want to look at API documentation and see if I could find that icon endpoint, just so I could read about what it is. There it is. It returns a single icon. That's what the noun project API endpoint does. Okay, so this is an example of a request that we will be generating with our script. Let's give this a whirl. I am going to switch back to VS Code. Okay, looks like we're at the right screen. So first things first, I have to actually put in my credentials. So this is my, I believe this is the first key that they want. Let me just double check the documentation. This authentication is going to be done through an API key and an API secret. So this is how that should look. Again, I'm going to zoom in. I think my text might be a little small for the camera. Let's see, where are we at? So now we have this, we have our authentication parameters. We have a script to run this request. Let's give it a shot. Ta-da, we now actually get a proper response. And it is a lot of text. So we are going to use something called pretty print, which I may have shown you at the very, very beginning of the curriculum. So if you don't remember, pretty print is an internal Python library that will print whatever you pass it in a somewhat pretty manner. So instead of just using our basic print, we are going to use pretty print, and we will be passing in, let's see, the response JSON. I actually can just go ahead, do this, move this up, and instead of print, I'm going to use pp.prettyprint. So this line is what loads the pretty printer object with these values, an indent of 2 and a depth of 2. And once that is initialized, I can use it to call the print method, separate from the built-in print method that we were using to create all this. So let's save and let's try this again. Yikes. I am missing a P. Okay, yeah, I see that. It wants a P. Let's try again. Ooh. So it's showing that we have an object with 4 keys and 4 values, including more objects inside the icons and another object inside usage limits. But here we have a functional API. We have a script that we are running from our Django backend. It hits the API endpoint and it returns a response. So let's see, going back to today's README. Any questions about this so far, by the way? Cool. It should be pretty easy. So let's see, what is next? I believe now that we have this, can anyone tell me what we need to do next? It's got
hide your keys.
Thank you. Exactly. We want to hide our keys because it should not be visible. So what we're going to do is, instead of having it inside our script, which we will be pushing to the repo, is we will create an environment file. It's as simple as using your command in your terminal to create an environment file, using a dot to, in front of the name. And this is our environment file. This is where we are going to transfer our secret and our key. I believe this first parameter was the key, and the second parameter is the secret. Now we can get rid of this. And let's see. We are going to be installing a package called python-.env. So let's pip install python.env. Cool. Now that that is installed, we are going to it's not clear if it wants this in the same script, but I think it's, yeah, it should be in the same script. I'm gonna now import from this new library the load.env function. And what this should do is it should load the values from our environment file. So we are going to use a function called load.env. This is what takes the environment variables from the .env file. And then we are going to confirm that it is taking the variables by using a print statement, API key. Now, since we just want to test this particular part of the code, I'm going to comment this out, and I'm going to save this, and let's give that a shot. I'm going to run this same script, and it's giving us a key error. It does not like API key. Why is that? Probably because it doesn't like the parameter names that we are using. Let's see, noun key, noun secret keys, that what it wants. Well, I'm going to start to wing it here. I'm going to try this instead. Because we're probably going to need both of these, is what I'm thinking. So let's see. Cool. We are now able to read both of those parameters. And so if we go back to that line that I deleted, what was that? That was auth equals OAuth1. And now we are going to pass in a noun key. Or actually, I don't want to do that. I am instead going to set some parameters. I'm going to say noun or API key equals os dot environ noun key. And I will do the same for the second parameter called the secret. And we are going to pass in these variables instead. So let's save, let's uncomment the rest of the code. And let's give this a shot.
So what was the reason for creating the extra variables? Is it just better practice?
Yeah, better practice. But yes, I could have just as easily passed it in directly, like so. But I will leave it like this, and I will now. So I've mentioned this before, but basically wherever you do land, wherever you end up working, they should have a set of standards and practices that you're going to want to follow. If anything, there's probably even going to be, for example, where I work, we utilize Rubocop because we write in Ruby that has a bunch of tests built in. So it checks for how you have formatted all of your code, and it will tell you if it doesn't like how you're coding something, basically. So yes, in general, it's good practice to be assigning things to variables, but maybe you land at a place where they don't want to just create a bunch of variables and pass around data too much, and they may prefer that you put it in directly into the OAuth. Generally, you'll have, I would say, a decent amount of freedom to go about it however you feel is best. And when working with your team, it's going to be a combination of these internal tests, these standards and practices, and feedback from your teammates and leaders that will dictate how the code ultimately ends up. So back to this, we are going to run the script one more time, and it looks like it worked. We were able to get a response from this endpoint. One last thing to do, now that we've moved our authentication values from the script to an environment file, we want to make sure that we don't push the environment file as well. And we do this with a git ignore file. So I'm going to code a .git ignore. And literally all I do is I add .env. Now, if I were to do a git status, it shows the files that I have edited, including this git ignore, but it is ignoring the .env. So there is no risk of me accidentally adding, merging, and pushing my environment file to the repository. Any questions so far?
When you name the .env, can you name it anything? Like you could call it Pokemon.env, or does it just need to be strictly .env?
I believe you could call it anything you want. I've honestly never tried. So let's see what happens if we try to change what it's called. Let's say Pokemon.env. Let's paste in our parameters here. And let's see if our script likes this format. I think in this case, because we're using a library, we will have to check this library's documentation to see how it's actually holding the information. And it looks like using anything aside from .env will not work, because I don't see anywhere here where we're defining the file name. So it must be built into it by default. This is the functionality for the os.environ library. We could even Google that, see if we could find some documentation on it, just to confirm. The OS module in Python functions for interacting with the operating system. So this function in particular, the environ function, it takes a parameter that, well, it says that it's a non-callable object, hence no parameter is required. It returns a dictionary representing the user's environmental variables. So nowhere in here is there any way to customize the environment file that it is accessing. So we would not be able to use anything but the .env file in this case. I can't guarantee for sure that it would be the same in any language, any and every other language. But in the languages that I have written in, I have not seen a use case for naming the environment file anything but .env.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Now that we have gotten through this part of the demo, we can go back to Pokemon application, and we will be doing the same steps in the Pokemon application, like installing a .env to load environment keys, and we will be creating a converters file, which let's find out what that converters file is supposed to do. It wants me to create my converters file inside the Pokemon app, I believe. So let's go ahead. Let's see. And cd into Pokemon app. Let's create a converters.py file. Oh, there's already a converters.py.
No, I think it's saying to put it on the Pokeball app,
Oh, the Pokeball app? Okay.
but I don't think we have one yet.
Oh, I see. Good catch. Good catch. Good catch. So if I scroll up a bit, it says, let's utilize this to add Pokeballs. So we got to create a Pokeball app first. Okay. So let's undo that. Can anyone remind me how to create an app in Django?
Start app.
All right. So I heard from Tumewa, just start app.
No, I think it's sorry, I have ice in my mouth. Yeah. What the mom put in chat.
What was put?
Start app and then the name.
Okay, so we are going to write Python, start up app name, and we are going to call it Pokeball. Sorry, what was that?
Right? I think it's start app.
Like that? Oh my God, what the hell's going on? Like that?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, it was Pokeball app, I believe.
Oops.
No such file or directory.
I think you capitalize Python too. I don't know if that makes a difference.
The manage.py, yeah. Manage.py.
Manage.py. Pokeball app. Cool. Now that we have created our Pokeball app, we can see it in our navigator. Can anyone tell me what I'm supposed to do with this Pokeball app?
Go to settings.py and add it to the apps.
Exactly, and that is inside the project directory. So let's go to our settings.py file and let's add our Pokeball app. And we will leave with some commas, and now that that's there, we can go into our Pokeball converters. Oh, there is no converters file, right? We are going to go into the Pokeball app folder, and we are going to create the converters.py file. Converters.py. Not that. I'm gonna delete that file because I can't type. And we are gonna try again. Okay. Believe I spelled it correctly this time. And in this file, we are going to first import from Django.urls the converters. And we are going to create a class called ball type converter. And we are going to use the converter's built-in string converter function. And we are going to say there are only certain balls that are allowed. And in this case, we want only master ball, Pokeball, Ultra Ball. Is that a real ball? And Great Ball. Next, we are going to define a toPython function where we create an if statement where if the value is lowercase and not in the allowed balls list, we raise an error. And then otherwise, we will be returning the value all lowercase. All right, now we got to go back to our URLs file and create a path to this new function. So let's say path equals, am I on the right? It's Pokeball, sorry, wrong part. I need to go back to Pokeball URLs. I got to make a URLs file for this. So first, we create a URLs file for our new Pokeball app, and we are going to import from, again, Django.urls, path, register converter. You'll recognize path. Register converter is new, but it's self-explanatory. And then from converters, we will import the ball type converter. And then from views, we will import the Pokeball image. So we're going to register the converter with our new function, and we will pass it in the converter, the ball type converter, with a string. This is registering the converter we created so we could utilize it from the paths in the URLs file. Now we create URL patterns, and we basically want to define a path. I'm going to call this Pokeball : ball. And it will have the Pokeball image, and it will have a name. There we go. I am missing this. Whoops. Now we could go to our views and write out some views. Again, after, of course, importing a bunch of stuff. We are Pokeball app. You're going to import from Django. Actually, I don't know if we need shortcuts, do we? We're going to import from the REST framework views so that we have access to API view and response. .env, we want the load.env file, which will allow us to access our environment variables. And we also want to import requests, so we could create requests. And OS works in tandem with .env to grab our environment variables. Not sure what happened there. Okay.
I think it's just REST framework and not frameworks.
Oh, good catch. Thank you. Okay, now we are going to do a load underscore dot env. And we could create our Pokeball image class. Pokeball image is going to use API view. We will define a get request. It grabs a request and grabs a ball. We only want to be able to allow this request for anybody that has authentication. So let's add some auth parameters. We are going to want .os environment with our noun key. Or actually, what did we rename it? We renamed it to, okay, it's still noun key. And then we're also going to want the secret key. And then we will be passing both of these into the endpoints. So let's use some, I forget what this is called, this F thing. I'm going to use this to grab from the noun project API an icon where the query, where we're passing in ball to the query, and then we will have a response. Whoops. From the requests. We pass in our authentication parameters, and then we convert our response, and then we return the response. And here we're going to be creating an object where we have a thumbnail, the response JSON. We're going to grab the icons at the index of 0. And from in there, there should be a thumbnail URL. Okay. So now that we have these views set up, we can now go back to the Pokedex project and add our URLs. All right, so here we are adding a path for our Pokeballs. It is going to be a V1 endpoint, and we're going to say Pokeballs, and we want to, let's go page. We want to include our Pokeball app URLs. I believe there is one last thing we have to do. In settings.py, import your Django secret from the environment file. Okay, so let's go back to our project settings. And here we have let's see. I'm not really sure what the step wants, so we are going to skip that. All right, let's see what's next. Testing works a bit different with the API since we don't want to actually make the API call every time we run our tests. So instead, unit tests have the ability to mock API calls. So we are now going to create a test. Let's go to our tests directory. And we are going to create a new test to test our API. Oh, That's so weird. Did it take me to a different? Okay, all right, here we are. We are back on track. Yes. I am going to go into my test directory. And we are going to create a new test for APIs. Nice. Do a bunch of importing from unit test mock import patch function from Django.test import test case from REST framework.test import API client. And from Django URLs, import reverse. All right, let's write our test. We are going to, whoops. First going to fix that. And then we have self.client equals API clients. And then we're going to write test Pokeball image API view self ball equals Pokeball. Thumbnail URL. Let's just use this example that they're giving us. Example.com image.png. Because we're not actually making a real API call, we don't need an actual real image. We are just going to mock everything. So let's give it a status code requirement 200, and then do some funky Python stuff here. And we are going to use patch to mock a patch request. Return a value for mock object. And run start. We will then grab the results, which we grab from the client. And we will be using a reverse function. And then we will assert that what we're getting from the response equals the thumbnail image. All right, that was a lot of typing. So let's see, we should now be able to run our tests. Let's go up a bit and Python manage.py. Is it just run tests?
I think it's tests if you have it in a directory.
Okay. So
just a space and then tests if the directory is called tests.
okay, cool, thank you. And is it test.py or just tests?
Just tests.
Okay, let's check this out. Cool, found 8 tests, and there is something that it doesn't like. Line 8 of my converters.py. Okay, let's try that again. Now we have a different error, which is progress. And the included URL does not appear to have any patterns in it. If you see the URL patterns variable with valid patterns in the file, then the issue was probably caused by a circular import. Okay, so let's see. It's saying it's from our Pokeball app URLs file. Pokeball app URLs. Where is our import failing? So this is the included URL config. So, okay. I'm just gonna double check what I have here. That is. So something's wrong with my syntax here. Let's do a comparison of another file. And let's see if we could spot what is wrong. So here we've got oh. Does anyone see it? I forgot to write patterns. All right, let's try this again. Now we have OAuth not defined. I believe that's supposed to be OAuth 1. Was that what it was? Yeah, let's go back to that file. I am missing a 1 in the OAuth. Let's see, what was that?
It was in the views.
Okay, views for Pokeball. Ah, there it is. And make sure we are importing it.
Capital A, I think there.
Oh, good catch, yes. And this gets imported from Quest's OAuth library. Okay. Nice. All right. First test passed. And we get some errors. Relation move app does not exist. So I believe we have to run some migrations. Now let's run migrate. No, I guess they've already been applied, and let's try that again. Cool.
So is that because you forked it down? So like we had all the code, but like nothing has been pushed to the database. So you got to migrate first, even if the code's already in there.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And it's the step that I usually always forget. But here we are. We were able to run all our tests, and all our tests have passed. Now let's see if... Yeah, I think that's about it. Does anyone have any questions? Awesome. So today's... Oh, go on.
Did you add all 8 of those tests today, or are some of those like previous tests?
Their previous test. The only
Okay.
test added was the API test. But yes, to review, we basically imported some libraries like the request library, the OAuth library, and then we created an environment file with our key and secret. We then created a new application that would utilize this API endpoint from the Noun project that basically loads or returns a ball icon. And we wrote some views, we wrote some URLs, and then we wrote a test. Today's exercise, let me switch screens, is called... Where is it? API show and tell. So let's... share this. Basically, for this assignment, you will be choosing an API from a list of public APIs, and you will be creating a Django project and running through the steps we ran through today to create an API request, to create, what is it called? Client and secret parameters to add into your environment file, and then the proper URLs and views to make that request from the Django application. Any questions? Awesome. I will create some breakout rooms. Y'all could feel free to take a break before you get started. Otherwise, jump in. Tiffany and I will be around to answer questions.